Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to another video where today we are covering all the 40k factions and how I would rank them on sort of a priciness scale. Now, 40k has always been a very expensive hobby. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise, because that's simply not true. But also is true, there have been very many different times where different units have been very easier or more expensive to collect. That's also true. That has always been true and always will be true, just by the nature of how 40k works as a game and as a hobby. And I decided I would cover sort of the general price of these factions on the whole. Now, it varies a lot, so there's not necessarily one exact metric. Some people will say, well, every 40k army is too expensive, but there's a spectrum to this. There's a spectrum to everything. So I decided I would try and sort of give my 2 cents on it. With just a few tiers, we got basically free, which is going to be the cheapest of the cheap, where you can get things for easily on the second market, or just in general, their units are very points intensive, so you don't need that many of them, and so on. And then not too pricey is similar. Standard is what I would call sort of, the standard. Then we have the slightly more expensive, then we have the Sell a Kidney factions, which will be the most expensive factions to collect in the game. Usually more hoardy, very fragile armies, stuff like that. And usually armies that aren't very well established are ones that are going to fall into that category. So first up we have DMech. Now DMech are, I'd say, for the most part, on the pricier side, right? Even with their points increases, their standard infantry and even elite infantry are very cheap points-wise, and pretty pricey money-wise. And the really only points-intensive units would be something like Kataphron Destroyers or Breachers and Castellan Robots. And even though you probably will want some of those in your army, one of them at least, they still only make up, even a max unit only makes up about a quarter of your army, which, if an army has that, that's usually a good sign. But the thing is, DMech has one of those and then a bunch of other very cheap units. So I do think these guys are going Sell a Kidney. Their characters are pretty cheap points-wise, infantry, their vehicles aren't super pricey either. So in general, they're not very collector-friendly, shall we say. Next up, we have the Blood Angels of the Space Marines. Now, most of the Space Marines have a few things going for them, right? They're well-established factions that have been around effectively forever. They've always been rather points-intensive relative to whatever point in the game's history you're talking about. They are always in the starter sets. They're always in discount boxes, stuff like that, right? Space Marines get a lot of love. No surprise there. They're the poster boys. They're always going to get more attention just because, well, Space Marines are cool, and they are what people think of when they think of 40k. But saying that, I still think that they're not quite as cheap as a couple other factions, but I am going to put them in not too pricey because you can get great deals secondhand basically everywhere, though it's a little harder for the chapter-specific things. Still, I think most Space Marines are going to end up here, really. And the same thing goes for the Black Templars, right? Black Templars have been around forever, and since Black Templars have traditionally run huge armies, you can generally find a lot of them secondhand for people that are selling off their armies and things like that. You can generally find them secondhand very cheap. And of course, Space Marines also have, a lot of third-party support, if you will. I'm trying not to really include that because at that point you could be like, oh, well, if you get a faction, you can have every single army for $380. But, I mean, okay, yes, I will concede that, but still, I'm just talking about the plastic kits. I'm not really talking about 3D printing here. But still, Black Templars, very similar to the Blood Angels. They've been around a long time, big fan base, tend to have a lot of stuff on the secondhand market. In general, you can get these guys together for not that much money, just because Space Marines are so common. Next up, we have Chaos Knights, and Chaos Knights, interestingly enough, compared to their loyalist counterparts, are actually more expensive. You think these factions would be very similar, and they are. I'm kind of overplaying this, but it does tend to be, and it has been for a long time, that Chaos War Dogs tend to do better than Chaos Big Knights, which, obviously, War Dogs are still very points intensive. They're still 300, 400 points per box, but they're not quite as intensive as the well, actually, now that I think about it, I think I've got this backwards, right? Because 2 War Dogs, let's just say War Dog Brigands, right? The shooting War Dogs, right? You get 2 of them in a box for, I believe it's, like $95? Which is, it's not nothing. But you do get, a little under 400 points, which is not too dissimilar to something like a Chaos Knight Rampager, which does cost quite a bit more in that regard, in terms of dollars, obviously. So I think, actually, since Chaos Knights make such extensive use of War Dogs, and War Dogs do vary a lot in price, but, War Dogs, Brigands, War Dog Executioners are another one that come to mind. They tend to be, about a quarter of your army for a box. Sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. But in general, War Dogs are pretty good points-wise. They're always around 300 or more points, 300 to 400 points, which isn't too much less than a full-size knight. So actually, I do think I'm going to put these guys up here. I think Chaos Knights are one of the cheaper factions in the game, right? Because you get, say, 8 boxes of... Or, not 8 boxes, what am I talking about? Say you just get 4 boxes of War Dogs, and you build them as whatever you want. That's still well over half your army, and then you just need to get a little bit more. And in general, they're not too pricey as far as factions go. Now, Necrons, interestingly enough, have become one of the cheaper factions to collect because of 9th edition. Indomitus was the most successful Warhammer box of all time, very signifying of the times we're in, really. And in the starter sets, which were also super popular, there was a lot of Necrons. So you will find on secondhand markets, Necrons tend to be very cheap, and you can generally get them together very quickly. They're very easy to paint. You won't need a lot of paint, thankfully. So in general, that's not something I'm really considering, but still, it's something to think about at least. Necrons are definitely one of the cheaper armies to collect in the game, and I think that. But when I say that, they still sort of are middling in terms of points. They do have some points-intensive units, which I am taking into account. Right, the Necrons have the Catan shards, which are very popular, and generally the smaller Catan shards are pretty cheap, actually, and give you a lot of points on the table, making Necrons very, very cheap to collect. But still, I think I'd put them in not too pricey, because they're not quite knight levels of points to dollars, etc. Now, Chaos Space Marines are very similar to normal Marines in their level of sort of points intensity. Unsurprisingly, they are, in fact, both Space Marine factions. And I think that does play into it in that they have very intensive units. They have Terminators, Chosen, Possessed. Even their normal Marines, they're about 100 points for 5. They also have, some big character. They have, like, Abaddon, for example, who's a very points-intensive character. But I still think they sort of balance out into that not too pricey category. I'll probably put them above the other two, just because Chaos Marines tend to be a little pricier than normal Marines points-wise, especially in modern times. So that's just sort of a product of the time we're in. Now we have the Custodes, and Custodes are the cheapest army to collect in the game. If you want to get an army together for, just under, $380, just buy 2 of the Custodes combat patrols, which would give you, one box with building no extra characters gets you 980 points, if I'm not mistaken. And then if you throw characters on top, it's like 1,200 points or something along those lines. Regardless, that may be a little off. I'm going to start running the numbers, but let me keep talking while I do that. Of course, Custodes are known for being very cheap point, or very expensive points wise, right? Each model has at a minimum about 40 points. So once you throw into the fact that you get basically their entire range of units that can also be built into different characters, you really do get just insane value out of their combat patrol. I'm just running the numbers just to make sure I'm not, I'm not out of my gourd. That's annoying. Like that, like this. Okay, I'm just pulling this up on the side. So we've got that plus 110. But I don't think anyone's really going to argue that this is the cheapest faction to collect in the entire game, when they are just so points intensive by their nature, and in general are so common. They're super popular. So even though they aren't super well established, I think they've only been in the game for about 8 years. So the combat patrol with no characters builds 910 points, which is, again, half your army. But then if you also build a couple of shield captains out of any of the squads, you could then get an extra 200 points or so. So yeah, it would be a little over half your army. So you get 2 of those boxes, and you have a complete army then and there. So again, by far the cheapest faction in the game. There is nothing that is going to be cheaper than that. It's just the way it is. Like, it doesn't get cheaper than this. Now, Dark Angels, like all Space Marines, fall into this not too pricey tier, and as a general rule of thumb, anything above not too pricey I generally consider a good starter army. They tend to be big models, which are easier to paint. They're more resilient. They're not super spindly. Even the Necrons, while they do have some spindly bits, they're so lightweight that they tend to be kind of hard to break. Like, when I drop a Necron Warrior from standing height, it just kind of bounces usually. Next up, we have the Drukhari. Now, the Drukhari are definitely on the pricier side of things. Even though the Eldar tend to be elite, they're not elite to the point of like Space Marines. You tend to need a lot of them, and they tend to not be terribly expensive. Like, for example, their elite unit, the Incubi, they only come in at 75 points for 5, and that kind of gives you a thermometer of the entire faction. So I am going to put them into getting a little pricey. I don't think they're as bad as DMech, because Drukhari are more established. They've been around longer, even though they've never been a particularly popular faction. Well, no, actually, I think I am going to put them in Selekidney, just because they don't have anything that points intensive. Most factions have either a big tank, a big walker or something, or a huge elite unit like Terminators that you can put a lot of points into. But I think the most expensive thing that Drukhari has is like less than 200 points. So that really puts into perspective. These guys are really expensive to collect. Now, Chaos Demons, I think, fall into standard, and let me tell you why. They're infantry, battle line, Bloodletters, Demonettes, Plague Bearers, and who's his name? What's his name? Horrors, right? They are all about 100 points for 10, which is fairly standard troop prices, and their elites tend to be, a little more than that, so pretty standard, but they have the Greater Demons and the named Greater Demons, and if you have a singular model that can make up a quarter of your army or more, I think you're doing pretty fine points-wise. Now, there are some exceptions to that we'll get to later, but I think in terms of like the core of the faction, it's not too bad to collect. They're generally pretty points effective, and their units aren't too cheap points-wise. Next up, we have the Death Guard. Now, the Death Guard were a starter faction recently, which does mean there's a decent amount of their stuff second-hand, but Death Guard are Space Marines, right? Even though they have, they have units like their Primarch, they do have, some of their units are slightly cheaper. Blightlord Terminators are the cheapest Terminators in the game. But they're the same as the other Space Marines, really. There's not much to say about them that isn't just, well, they're Space Marines, and with Space Marines, you get the Space Marine vehicles, which are all sort of okay points-wise. They have Terminators. They have Plague Marines as their core battle line, which are generally going to be around 20 points a model, or sometimes they drop down to around 16, but, the point still stands. And these guys have Mortarion, of course, and Mortarion's about a quarter of your army for a decent chunk of change, no doubt, but still, that does, help with the collecting of the army. Now, this is a bit of an older list, so this is Death Watch, but we're just going to call this Imperial Agents. And I think Imperial Agents are really expensive for a lot of reasons. The thing with Imperial Agents is, while they do have access to Grey Knight Terminator squads, which helps a little bit, their core units, if you will, are a bunch of very lightweight kill teams. Imperial Breachers, Adeptus Arbites, RBTs, Voidsmen at Arms, Rogue Traders, Inquisitorial Henchmen. You can't bring the Death Watch Veterans, which are still relatively points intensive, but even still, you can bring... that does help a little bit, but as a whole, the only units that are very points dense are the Assassins and the Death Watch and the Grey Knights, which is only, 5 units? I guess 9 if you count all the Assassins, out of a relatively large codex of units that tend to be quite squishy and not super points dense. Next up, we have the Eldari, and I think the Eldar, right, they're a cut above against their Dark Brethren, if you will. Not only have they also been around a very long time, very well established faction that tends to be decently popular. They have some more points dense units. We have the Wraith units, which Wraith Guard on their own are very points dense. They have the Wraith Lord, the Wraith Knights. They have some more tanks like the Fire Prism and the Falcon. But they're sort of AdMech. It's similar to the AdMech, right? Where they have a couple points intensive units that you probably will want to bring some of, but on the whole, most of their infantry isn't too expensive. The Aspect Warriors are all hovering around 100 points, or some even a lot cheaper, like the Striking Scorpions, which are 65 points for 5. And in general, they're getting a little pricey. I don't think it's as bad as these guys down here, just because they do have, those huge units of Wraith, or, multiple units of Wraith units that can really bulk up the points cost. Next up, we have Grey Knights. And Grey Knights, actually, I think, despite the fact that they're Space Marines, and I know most of the Space Marines are in the same tier, I think the Grey Knights... Are the Grey Knights more expensive points-wise enough to go into a higher tier? And I think that's certainly something to talk about, right? Because the Grey Knights don't have a lot of units. And they have a good combat patrol, so that does help. And the Grey Knights have been around for a while. What has it been? About 20 years since they were introduced? 23 years? Something like that? No, it had to have been longer than that, because I have a Grey Knight model from before I was born. I think, at least. Maybe it was a little after I was born. Regardless, if you look at, for example, their Terminators, they're some of the more expensive Terminators in the game. Their standard Strike Marines are the price of Veteran Marines. And the things like Dread Knights are surprisingly cheap, and I think it balances out to put them at the top of not too pricey. Not quite basically free, but they're on the edge. Genestealer Colts, another notoriously expensive faction, and these guys suffer from Drukhari syndrome, as I'm going to call it, where they don't really have that many points-intensive units. Now, the one that comes to mind, I suppose, would be the Aberrants, right? Because the Aberrants are these big, beefy, muscly aliens that hit hard in melee and are pretty tough, but even still, they're not that points intensive. A unit of 10 of them is 300 points, so a little less than a quarter of your army, but you're not going to want to run more than that, really, unless you're really into the Twisted Helix sort of aesthetic. But they sort of, they don't have a lot aside from that. Genestealers are sort of expensive. They're, 85 points for 5. And in general, they are very fragile, very cheap points-wise, and you're going to need a lot of them because of that, which does put them into Selekini, I think. And they don't even have a unit. I think I'll put the Drukhari down here, right? Because at least AdMech and Imperial Agents have those units that are really points-intensive to collect. Next up, we have the Guard, another one that has been historically very expensive to collect, and they definitely still are on the more expensive side, though it's not as bad as in the past where people were running 10 units of 30 conscripts, right? And the Guard are similar in some ways to the Genestealer Colts and the Drukhari, but they have slightly more intensive units than some others. They have units like of course, their Leman Russes are all not too expensive points-wise, but you're going to want a lot of them, and they are more points-dense than most things in the entirety of Drukhari and Genestealer Colts. And they also have the option of things like the Rogel Dorn, which is very expensive points-wise, and of course, the Baneblade. I think that is part of what sets it apart, is that these guys have so many units that there's obviously going to be some very expensive ones. Rogel Dorns and Baneblades, of course, are the big ones. And then most of them do run very tank-heavy, which the tanks are probably at this point in Warhammer's history, at some of their more expensive. It's not like 5th edition, where you could get a Predator for 70 points. What a wild time that was, huh? So I think I'm going to put them near the bottom of getting a little pricey. I don't think they're quite as bad as the Selekidney factions, because they do have units that are nearing a quarter of your army, or 250 points, stuff like that. The Imperial Knights are, I'm just going to call it, same as Chaos Knights. They tend to be a little more expensive for their big knights points-wise, but cost is the same. They're very cheap to collect in general, and Knights are a popular faction, which I believe just had their 10th anniversary, didn't they? Because they came out in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. It might have been 2012. No, maybe it was after 2014. Regardless, they're a middling-aged faction. And in general, very points intensive and not too expensive to collect in totality. Next up, we have the Tyranids, and the Tyranids are getting similar to the Necron treatment, right? They've got a lot of love this edition in all the starter sets, in Leviathan. Tyranids are a very well-loved faction that have been in the game since the very beginning, so they have a long history, a backlog of models. And in general, they tend to have the full spectrum of points-intensive units, right? We have Hormagaunts and Neragaunts for, 50 to 60 points for 10. And then you jump to the other end and you have, Carnifexes, 2 of them for 250 points. Or, what's it called? The big, not Nera Tyrant, why do I want to call it that? Norn Emissary. Norn Emissary, almost 300 points. And then there's things in the middle, like the Tyrannifex, which for its points is pretty cheap, dollars-wise. And I think that does earn them in the not too pricey sort of area, right? Because there's a lot of ways you can build Nids. Monster Mash, Balanced, Hordes, and so on. Which I think earns them that sort of place. Next up we have the Orcs, again, another historically expensive faction that I think is pretty similar to the Guard, given how both the Guard and the Orcs are some of the most popular factions in all of 40k. They get a good amount of love. They've been very popular forever. And the Orcs less so than the Guard have some intensive units, right? Nothing too crazy, which I think does put them at the top of sort of the Sella-Kidney tier, because their most intensive units you're going to see is going to be like Knobs with a War Boss, which is 270 points, or 275 points, rather. Things like Battle Wagons aren't terribly expensive. Trucks aren't very expensive either. Now, they do have a couple units that comes to mind, which does, in theory, make Orcs, I believe, the cheapest faction in the game. I did a video on this a while ago, where if you buy 2 Stompas and Ghazghkull Thraka, that is 2,000 points for very cheap. That was Ghazghkull, and then, or was it a Beast Boss and 3 Stompas? You know what? It doesn't matter. Regardless, in general, they're teetering on getting a little pricey in Sella-Kidney, but I'm going to drop them down to Sella-Kidney just because their most archetypical units that you're going to see aren't as intensive. Like, if you think of Guard, you think of the tanks. But if you think of Orcs, you generally think of the Orcs themselves, not so much, Morkanauts, Gorkanauts, and even things like Death Dreads aren't terribly expensive points-wise. Next up, we have the Sisters. Now, Sisters are in Sella-Kidney. I cannot tell a lie. They are generally pretty cheap. Most of their units cap out at like 160 points, 170 points. There are some exceptions. The one that comes to mind, Paragon Warsuits, but you generally only want one of those. Even like Celestine is only, what is she, 75? No, she's not 70 points. How much is Celestine? I'm going to pull it up. But Celestine is decently expensive, but her bodyguard isn't. And I think that's sort of the thing. Like, while they have a couple intensive units, they're very, very expensive to collect. And I think it puts them more towards the end here, as Sisters have had a very rough history in 40k, right? They came out in 2nd edition, got a little bit of support in 3rd edition, and then they were living off an index until 7th edition, where they got their grand return to 40k, where they've been ever since, with their big plastic range refresh, which was very nice to see, I will say. But Sisters have always been a rather pricey army to collect. And in general, they're expensive. There's no way of, beating around the bush. Now, here we have normal Space Marines. Now, I should put these with just the rest of the Space Marines, and I think I will. Though I almost argue that generic Marines are easier to collect than any of the others, just because, well, you can use pretty much everything, right? You don't have to aim for anything particular, but still, I'm going to put them in not too pricey, just because, that's what I'm doing for most of the Space Marines. And I'll put the Space Wolves there, too. It's the same as everyone else, right? They've got points-intensive units. They've been in the game for a long time. Very, very well-established, fan-loved or hated faction. And in general, they tend not to be terribly pricey. Next up, we have the Tau. And I think the Tau fall into standard, right? They're standard, they're battle line troops, right? They're like, what are they, 85 points, which is fairly low, but then you have some intensive things like, storm surges, crisis suits, crisis commanders, hammerhead gunships, stuff like that, which I think earns them more of a standard. They probably could go down to getting a little pricey, but I think just by their nature, I don't think that it's fair to say that to them, just because they do have, they have those battle suits, they have the big tanks, stuff like that. They're not too expensive to collect, but they're also, they're not super cheap. Comparing, them to, say, Space Marines, though, they're definitely not to that same level, right? Because their troops are about 100 points. The strike teams are a lot cheaper than the breachers are, at the very least. But I think this is a fair place to put the Tau, right? Because they are sort of a pseudo-elite army with some very dense units with their crisis suits, or even, as I mentioned, Riptides, or even the Storm Surge in some odd way. Next up, we have the Thousand Sons, and the Thousand Sons are pretty similar to the Grey Knights, actually, right? Their normal Marines are some of the most expensive in the game. Their Terminators are also, I believe, not the most expensive, but I think they might be second most expensive in the game. They have some great value boxes, like the Sorcerer's box, which gets you 3 Exalted Sorcerers, which I think maths out to, like 200 or so points, if I'm not mistaken, because, well, you could put one on a disc. But, say you did do 2 Exalted Sorcerers and 1 on a disc, that's going to be, 300 points. I think the Thousand Sons are probably right up here with the Grey Knights in terms of cheapness to collect. Now, Thousand Sons don't have the same level of establishment as the others. The Thousand Sons were just sort of a subsection of Chaos Marines for a very long time. But still, I think that point still applies. Next up, we have the Leagues of Votann, right? The Leagues of Votann are one of the most expensive factions to collect. I was making lists the other day, right, for my factions that I have, and when I had included all the units I wanted to in my Leagues of Votann army, it still was under 1,000 points. Their units are dead cheap, and there's not a lot of them, so you're going to need a lot of duplicates. And even their expensive things, like the Land Fortress, in terms of points per dollar, it's not great. Overall, these guys are definitely, very expensive to collect, which is very strange. And given the fact that they're a brand new faction for the most part, they do not have a second-hand market that's very well established. Now, World Eaters are Space Marines, right? World Eaters have more of an established history than the other Trader Marines, just because there were sort of 3 tiers to it, right? Rubric Marines were an upgrade for Chaos Space Marines for a long time. Khorne Berserkers were famous for their models sticking around forever, and Plague Marines were on and off coming back in metal and stuff like that. But Rubric Marines, you can find these guys secondhand. People were pretty much paying you to take them away because, well, no one really liked the old Khorne Berserker models. Same thing as always. They're Space Marines. You're going to find a lot of them. Their combat patrol is good. That's sort of what it is. Space Marines go in this tier. That's why there's so much in that tier, is just because this has split all the Space Marines up into different factions. But, if we consolidate all of this, it's basically the Magic Marines, all the other Marines, and then Tyranids and Necrons. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.